Welcome, dear friends, to Moonlight Audiobook. I'm Julian, your host for today's mystery into shadows and secrets. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'm thrilled to have you with me. So, pour yourself a warm cup of tea, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for a mystery that stretches across the sands of time. In this video, we travel to the sun-drenched ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, where whispers of betrayal and murder disturb the dust of history. In the heart of an archaeological dig, a woman is found dead inside a locked room, and only one man can uncover the truth. The legendary Belgian detective, Monsieur Hercule Poirot, with his immaculate moustache and razor-sharp little grey cells. What secrets lie buried beneath the stones? Who among the living fears the past the most? This is Hercule Poirot, Murder in Mesopotamia. Chapter 1. Whispers Beneath the Sun. The desert sun hung low over the ruins of Tel Tarimja, casting long, eerie shadows across the excavation site. Time itself seemed to pause in this arid corner of Mesopotamia, where broken stone relics whispered secrets of empires long buried beneath sand and silence. But on this particular evening, it was not the ghosts of antiquity that disturbed the peace. It was the modern echo of something far more sinister. A scream, sharp and primal, tore through the twilight. It came from the north wing of the expedition house, an austere structure built of pale stone and shaded verandas that overlooked the dig site. Within seconds, the small, insular community of archaeologists, assistants, and staff had rushed to the corridor outside room 12. There, crumpled beside the brass-handled door, lay the lifeless body of Louise Liedner, the expedition director's wife. Her dark hair fanned around her like a spilled inkblot, and her eyes, once vivid with intelligence and quiet authority, stared blankly at the ceiling. A blood-stained indentation at her temple suggested a swift, brutal blow. The room itself was locked from the inside. No window open. No weapon visible. Dr. Erich Liedner, the famed epigrapher and leader of the excavation, stood in stunned silence. A man known for his meticulous calm, he now looked impossibly small, dwarfed by the enormity of what had occurred. His grief, though real, was strangely measured, as though restrained beneath layers of academic detachment. Miss Anne Maitland, Louise's young nurse companion, stood nearby, trembling. She had found the body. Her voice was barely a whisper as she told the others, "I knocked, and when there was no answer, I opened the door with my key. She was just there." The rest of the team, archaeologists, translators, local workers, assembled in uneasy silence. There was Father Lavini, the enigmatic French cleric cataloguing the temple inscriptions, and Richard Carey, the moody yet brilliant field director with a past steeped in secrets. Mrs. Mercado, ever watchful and sharp-tongued, clutched her handbag as though it were a shield. Her husband, the camp doctor, muttered something about heart failure, though even he didn't sound convinced. There was no sign of forced entry, no apparent struggle. And yet the unease in the air was palpable, thicker than the desert dust that clung to every corner of the compound. By dusk, word of the tragedy had already been dispatched to the authorities in Hassania. But it was clear that this crime required a mind capable of dissecting more than mere evidence. It demanded someone who could peer beyond appearances, who could detect malice beneath layers of fear and sun-hardened civility. And so, a telegram was sent to Baghdad. Hercule Poirot, retired but never truly at rest, received the message over dinner at his hotel. He read it twice, placed the paper down beside his untouched glass of sherry, and slowly tapped his fingertips together. "Murder," he said softly, "in the land of Babel. The dust of ages hides many secrets, does it not?" He rose from the table, adjusted the cuffs of his pristine white dinner jacket, and nodded to the maître d'. "A car, if you please." I must attend to a matter most delicate and most deadly. Far away, under the Mesopotamian sky, a killer waited in the shadows of history. Chapter 2. The House at Tel Tarimja. The late afternoon sun stretched long, burnt shadows across the walls of the excavation compound. Dust clung to every surface like a memory unwilling to fade. Within this desolate corner of Mesopotamia, under canvas roofs and between baked stone, a small world now trembled beneath the weight of suspicion. Poirot moved through it with the delicacy of a man feeling for a hairline crack in porcelain. The death of Mrs. Louise Leadner had cast a sudden, ashen veil over the expedition. Her body, gently taken from the bedroom and placed under a sheet in the small infirmary tent, seemed to radiate silence. But it was the living who gave Poirot his cues. And they, each one, were speaking volumes in what they did not say. Inside the communal mess tent, the team had gathered at Colonel Carberry's direction. Chairs scraped against the uneven ground. Canteens were untouched. All eyes flickered, some guarded, some glazed, some too sharp. Poirot stood near the open flap, allowing the desert wind to stir the edge of his cuff. Dr. Leadner sat rigidly at the table's head, hands folded as if in prayer or paralysis. His spectacles caught the weak light, but his eyes were red-rimmed and vacant, lost behind some inner fog. Beside him, Nurse Amy Leatheran, efficient, no-nonsense, and trying rather hard not to appear affected, held her chin up in a way that suggested control rather than calm. She met Poirot's gaze briefly, but it was a look lined with worry. "Permit me," Poirot began, gently, "to first express my condolences. I understand this is a grievous shock. But one must begin always with the facts." Silence greeted him, taut as a drawn wire. Poirot's eyes swept the group, registering not only faces but posture, spacing, glances. He took in Richard Carey, the archaeological second-in-command, a man of few words, with weathered skin and the steady gaze of someone accustomed to secrets buried under layers. He sat slightly apart, his folded arms not out of defiance, but habit. Joseph Mercado, thin, pale, and sweating despite the cooling evening, shifted nervously in his seat. A man of academic pretensions, but lacking the composure of conviction. His wife, Marie, tight-lipped and observant, rarely looked at anyone but her husband. Then there was Emmett, young and impressionable, fingers twitching with some unnamed need to fidget. A junior hand in the dig, and yet one who knew more than he pretended. He avoided Poirot's gaze entirely. Miss Anne Maitland, the expedition's secretary, stood at the far end, hands clasped over a notebook she hadn't opened. Her face was unreadable, but her stance was defensive. She radiated competence and restraint. Colonel Carberry introduced them all briskly, but Poirot was hardly listening. He was already observing the geometry of interaction. Who leaned toward whom, who glanced where, who said nothing at all. It is not merely the presence of the killer we must consider, Poirot mused aloud, voice soft, but the arrangement of the silences. His words caused several heads to lift. "I will not ask you for your alibis. Not yet," he continued. "First, I will speak to each of you. Alone. As you are now, you are too careful with your answers. But a mind unsettled speaks with more honesty than it intends." He offered a small bow and turned toward the exit. "We will begin tomorrow morning. Tonight, rest. As much as the desert will allow." The group began to disperse, the tension breaking into whispers and sideways glances. Poirot, meanwhile, walked slowly back toward the room where the body had been found. The murder scene had not been disturbed. The room was modest but elegant. White walls, patterned rug, writing desk with notepaper left unfinished. The window shutters had been fastened from within. The bed, now stripped, still bore the faint scent of jasmine. Poirot moved slowly, careful not to touch. Instead, he studied. Not the objects, but their placement. The rhythm of the room, the way the rug was just slightly off-center. The chair angled as though someone had risen in haste. The faint impression of a shoe print near the edge of the doorway, not deep enough for the police to bother with, but curious in its positioning. He closed his eyes. Murder, he whispered to himself. But not of the ordinary kind. This was not committed in rage, nor fear. This was planned, calmly, with the intelligence of someone who knew her well. He turned, hands behind his back, and walked out into the cooling Mesopotamian dusk. Above the compound, the sky deepened to indigo, and a single star glimmered where the horizon met the future. Tomorrow, he would begin, and the masks would begin to slip. Chapter 3. A Circle of Sand and Secrets. The morning arrived wrapped in a veil of pale gold. The Mesopotamian desert stirred slowly, its silence punctuated only by the distant murmur of wind among the tent ropes and the muted rustling of papers in the dig archive. Hercule Poirot, ever immaculate in a pale linen suit and perfectly tied cravat, sat beneath the awning outside the main compound. A single wicker chair faced his own. A jug of cool water stood nearby, untouched. He had asked them to come to him, one by one. Not to interrogate, but to observe. Nurse Leatherin arrived first, prompt, composed, and efficient. "I understand you were close to Madame Leadner." Poirot began, without preamble. The nurse nodded. "I was her companion more than her nurse. She was healthy, at least in the body." "Ah," Poirot raised an eyebrow. "And the mind?" A shadow flickered behind her eyes. "She was nervous, watchful. I had the impression she feared something, though she never said quite what. At night, she would lock the shutters and sleep with the light on. She claimed it was a headache, but I knew better." "Did she speak of enemies?" "No, but she often read old letters, burned some, hid others in her suitcase. Once, I caught her at the window in the early hours, watching. She jumped when I called her name." Poirot leaned forward. "You believe she expected someone?" "I think she was terrified someone had already arrived." When Nurse Leatherin left, Poirot did not pause. He simply motioned for the next to be sent in. Richard Carey entered with slow, deliberate steps. A man hardened by desert sun and time, he met Poirot's gaze without flinching. "You were in charge of the site when Dr. Leadner was otherwise occupied?" Poirot asked. "I was. The team respects me, but Louise was." Carey hesitated. "She commanded attention. People noticed her." "Yes," Poirot said, gently. "A beautiful woman is often at the center of a storm." "And did you admire her, Monsieur Carey?" A pause. "I did." Poirot let silence hang between them. "But it was complicated," Carey added. "She played a dangerous game sometimes. Teasing, controlling, drawing people in. I think she liked having power over others, even if she didn't admit it." "You sound bitter, monsieur." "I'm being honest." "And where were you at the time of her death?" "In my tent, writing up the stratigraphy report. Alone." Poirot nodded. "Thank you. And now, Marie Mercado, if you please." She arrived cool and elegant, dressed in soft beige linen and large sunglasses that concealed half her face. "Your husband seems nervous," Poirot said with a hint of mischief. "He's unwell," she replied crisply. "Poor digestion. The heat does not suit him." "And you, Madame Mercado? Do you enjoy the heat?" "I enjoy structure. Routine. This place has neither." Poirot studied her. "Tell me, did you get on with Madame Leadner?" Marie folded her arms. She liked attention. I don't give it freely. You disliked her. I didn't respect her. She used charm as currency. Flirted with men half her age. And she thought herself clever, but I could see the fear behind her eyes. She feared something. Or someone. And where were you yesterday afternoon? In the shade, with Joseph. Reading. I rarely leave his side. Poirot made a mental note. Loyalty or surveillance. Next came Joseph Mercado, pale, damp at the temples, hands shaking slightly. You're a chemist, are you not, monsieur? Mercado blinked. Yes. I assist with chemical analysis. Pottery glazes, trace compounds. And Madame Liedner, did she seek your company? No, no. We barely spoke. I prefer quiet. Poirot's voice was gentle. And did you see anyone enter her room yesterday? No. I wasn't near there. I swear. Poirot tilted his head. Why are you so certain of your innocence, Monsieur Mercado? Mercado stammered. Because I didn't do anything. Ah, but that is what everyone says. The man looked ready to collapse. Poirot dismissed him with a kind smile. Then came Anne Maitland, sharp-eyed and severe, her dark hair pinned with mathematical precision. Tell me, mademoiselle, what did you observe yesterday? Nothing. Her tone was clipped. I was typing reports in the office tent. And did Madame Liedner confide in you? No. She had no interest in me. Poirot narrowed his eyes. And you, in her? I observed. I see more than I say. And what did you see? And hesitated. She manipulated people. And she had a way of looking over her shoulder, as if she expected the past to return. Poirot gave a tiny nod. Merci, mademoiselle. Finally came Emmett, the junior assistant. Young, fidgety, eager to please. You admired Madame Liedner? Poirot asked directly. She was stunning. Everyone noticed her. And she noticed you? A sheepish grin. Maybe. Once she asked me to fix a broken shutter in her room. Her hand brushed mine. Accidentally, I think. But I remember. Did you see anything unusual before she died? Emmett frowned. Just that she'd been nervous lately. Jumpy. Once I heard her arguing with someone. A man. Could have been Carey or Mercado. I couldn't tell. Poirot leaned back. With that, the interviews were complete. But they were merely pieces, half-truths, omissions, glimpses of motive and fear. He rose, returning to the compound, his thoughts sharpening. The truth, he knew, was present already. But truth does not shout. It whispers, in mismatched alibis, in trembling fingers, in the corner of a page left unsent. And Hercule Poirot had begun to hear it. Chapter 4. Echoes of a Nervous Past. By mid-afternoon, the camp buzzed with a subdued but unmistakable shift in energy. Word had spread, unspoken, yet clearly understood, that one of them had drawn suspicion. The police from Hassania arrived in a cloud of dust. 2 uniformed men and a weary inspector who spoke limited French and even less English. Their investigation was pragmatic, clumsy, even, rooted in what was obvious, not what was probable. Dr. Liedner, grief-stricken but compelled by duty, led them to his wife's room. There, he said, voice thick with anguish. That's where I found her. She had been seated at her writing desk. The blunt trauma to the back of her skull, the blood congealed on the edge of the wood. These things no longer shocked the doctor. What unsettled him now was the silence in her absence. Poirot stood silently as the inspector surveyed the room. The window was shuttered. The door had been unlocked. A tray of tea, untouched. No signs of struggle. Crime of opportunity, the inspector muttered, gesturing vaguely. Someone entered when she was alone. Pardon, Poirot interjected, but Madame Leadner never sat with her back to the door. She was careful, anxious, always alert. The inspector shrugged. Then someone she trusted. They returned to the group. Poirot remained outside the growing circle, arms folded neatly behind his back, listening. It was then that Joseph Mercado was asked to step forward. His hands trembled. His eyes were bloodshot. He hadn't eaten. His wife hovered behind him like a pale shadow. The inspector addressed the camp. We have found something in Monsieur Mercado's tent. From a brown canvas satchel, an officer produced a vial. Arsenic, he announced. Undeclared. Illegal. A stunned silence followed. Mercado stumbled backward. I use it only for compound analysis. A minute amount. But you did not declare it, the inspector snapped. And we have a witness who says you argued with the deceased. All heads turned. Young Emmett stood, face pale but defiant. 2 days ago, I heard voices from the hallway. It was Mrs. Leadner and Mr. Mercado. She was angry, said she'd tell someone what he was doing. What was he doing, Emmett? Poirot asked quietly. I don't know, the boy admitted. But she said, if you think you can poison everyone here like you poisoned your work in Baghdad, you're mistaken. The air shifted palpably. The inspector turned triumphantly to Poirot. Voila! Motive. Illicit poison. Conflict. The man was desperate. Poirot raised one thin eyebrow. It is compelling. Joseph Mercado collapsed into a chair, his breath shallow. His wife gripped his hand with both of hers. He didn't kill her, she whispered. He couldn't. No one saw him during the time of the murder, the inspector pointed out. No alibi. And he had access to the tent at all times. Poirot gave a gentle nod. Indeed. Everything fits. Perhaps a little too well. The inspector ignored him. We will detain him until the paperwork is complete. Mercado was led away without resistance. The sun dipped lower in the sky. The shadows lengthened. People whispered, tension snapping like brittle canvas in the desert wind. But Hercule Poirot remained unmoved. That night, he walked the perimeter of the dig, hands clasped behind his back, deep in thought. There were no footprints near Madame Leadner's window. No tampered locks. The tea untouched. The door unforced. A man intending to poison her would not choose blunt force. Poirot stopped outside the deceased's room. He entered slowly. The desk stood exactly as it had, a notebook open, the final lines of a letter abandoned mid-thought. He scanned the walls, photographs, excavation maps, a prayer pinned near the bed. Her perfume lingered faintly. Poirot's gaze settled on a framed photograph of Louise and Dr. Leadner, taken a year ago in France. The date in the corner had smudged, but the position of their hands, hers resting on his arm, fingers subtly curled back, his gaze elsewhere, spoke volumes. Poirot murmured to himself, Non, this is not the act of a frightened chemist. This was personal, intimate, swift. He returned to his own tent, where a sheaf of handwritten notes awaited him. Names, impressions, contradictions. He circled one phrase, she always sat facing the door. And below it, another, no one heard a scream. No one. He tapped the end of his fountain pen thoughtfully. Joseph Mercado may have secrets. But he was not a killer, not of this kind. Someone had orchestrated this scene with cunning care, knowing exactly how suspicion would fall. Poirot smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "The false answer," he whispered, "is sometimes more elegant than the truth. But it remains false all the same." Chapter 5. A Clue Written in Silence. The morning after Joseph Mercado's arrest dawned quietly. The desert sun pressed itself flat against the tents, heat rising in thin shimmering waves from the sand. But inside the expedition house, the atmosphere was colder than ever. The silence of the group had evolved into something denser, more brittle. Hercule Poirot took his breakfast alone. He declined the polite offers to join the others, preferring instead to spread his neatly folded napkin over his knee, pour his tea just so, and contemplate the impossible geometry of murder. For Poirot, it always began with space. The room where a life had ended. The angles. The objects. The silences. And so, once his second cup of tea had been finished, and the toast, slightly overdone, had been consumed in full, Poirot returned to Louise Leadner's bedroom. This time, he entered with a measuring tape in hand, a thin roll of chalk, and an expression of quiet reverence. He stood in the doorway for a long time. The desk remained by the window. A half-written letter still fluttered faintly when the breeze found its way through the shutters. The chair, toppled by Dr. Leadner when he'd found her, had been replaced upright. The walls bore their framed sketches, ancient maps of excavation grids, and a childlike crayon portrait, done, Poirot suspected, by one of the local workers. But it was the window he returned to. It was shuttered, as it had been when Louise was found. He opened it gently, the hinges creaking. Then he stepped outside into the narrow passage between the building and the outer compound wall. The sand was undisturbed. No footprints. No dragging marks. He crouched, examining the soil near the window's base. A dry fig leaf lay curled like parchment. The earth, though firm, would have betrayed even a careful step. He nodded once. A voice called from behind. "Still think it wasn't Mercado?" It was Richard Emmett. The young man stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes shaded with suspicion. He was hiding something. We all knew it. Poirot turned his head slightly. Hiding something, yes, but not, I believe, a body. Emmett frowned. "Then how do you explain the poison?" "I do not explain it. Not yet. But I note this. Madame Leadner was killed by a single, precise blow to the back of the head. Not the weapon of a chemist. And certainly not the method of a man who feared her enough to argue with her openly." He dusted his hands and rose. Back in the room, Poirot knelt by the desk and inspected the surface. Smooth. No bloodstains. Yet she had fallen against it. He examined the chair again. The wooden slats, though sturdy, showed a faint dent at the top rail. He measured it, 91 centimeters from the floor. Then he measured the bruise pattern detailed in Dr. Leadner's report, 89 centimeters from the base of the skull. It aligned. But, Poirot murmured to himself, how did the blow come without sound? No one heard a cry. Not a scuffle. Not a breath. He turned to the door. It was standard camp construction. Heavy, with a clunky metal latch. No signs of forced entry. No scratches. He tested it. It clicked shut with a dull finality. Then he turned his attention to the inside of the window. A small iron hook held the shutter closed. It could not be opened from outside, not unless someone had installed a string. But Poirot found no such mechanism. No, it was not the window. He stood still in the center of the room and closed his eyes. He saw her, Louise, seated at the desk, posture straight, pen poised. She hears something. A voice. A gentle knock. Something familiar. She turns her head. She does not scream. There is no struggle. She rises perhaps, just slightly. And then the blow. Swift. Quiet. Merciless. Poirot opened his eyes. Someone she knew, he said softly, and someone she trusted enough to let close. No signs of defense, because there was no fear, only surprise. He opened her desk drawers, examining the contents with surgical precision. Letters, journals, carbon paper, a pressed flower, and then a photograph tucked between pages of a notebook. It was not of the dig or her husband. It was a group photo, taken months ago, perhaps in Syria. Louise was at the center, her arm around a dark-haired woman, and behind her, smiling stiffly, was an Mercado. Poirot stared. The position of the arm, the subtle lean, the eyes. Oh, those eyes. He slipped the photograph into his pocket. Later that evening, Poirot stood beside the compound's central well. The camp had grown quieter. The dig was halted indefinitely, and the workers had returned to their tents. Only a few whispers remained, of ghosts, of curses, of things that never should have been uncovered. Dr. Liedner approached him, shoulders slumped. "Have you found anything new?" Poirot hesitated. Then, "I believe I have found what did not happen, which, you understand, is as revealing as discovering what did." Dr. Liedner's brow furrowed. "You mean?" "I mean that the room was a stage, but the crime was no performance. It was private, swift, devoid of spectacle, and only someone familiar with Madame Liedner's fears, someone intimate, could have orchestrated it." He looked past the doctor, toward the fading sky. A sliver of moonlight began to rise above the cliffs. Poirot's voice dropped, soft as a prayer. The killer did not climb through the window. He walked through the front door, and she let him in. Chapter 6. The Dead Woman's Eyes. Night in the Mesopotamian desert had a peculiar texture, not the softness of English dusk nor the velvet hush of the Mediterranean. It was brittle, crackling, filled with the whisper of sand shifting under the stars. A fragile silence that made every sound, the flutter of canvas, the scrape of a sandal, unbearably loud. Hercule Poirot stood by his tent, arms folded neatly behind him. His gaze was fixed not on the sky, but on the narrow pathway between the tents, where the compound wall loomed like a watchful sentinel. He did not move when a scream tore through the stillness. It came from the direction of the dig site. Then, footsteps, shouts, lights swinging wildly. He turned briskly and began walking, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes. By the time he arrived at the excavation trench, a small crowd had gathered. Dr. Riley, the expedition's physician, knelt over a figure sprawled in the sand. And Mercado stood nearby, hands clasped over her mouth, her face bone white. Richard Emmett hovered behind her, jaw clenched, his eyes darting nervously. Captain Maitland, the security attaché from the local British outpost, emerged from the darkness holding a revolver. Poirot did not need to ask. It was David Willoughby, the assistant architect. His lifeless body lay half in the trench, arms twisted awkwardly, eyes staring up at nothing. "Blunt force trauma," said Riley grimly, straightening. Temples caved in. Death would have been instant. Poirot's eyes traveled across the group. A shovel lay nearby. Blood darkened the sand in a slow, spreading stain. And next to the handle, barely visible, was a footprint, sharp, distinct, and unmistakably a woman's. He did not speak of it. Instead, he asked, "Who found him?" And Mercado raised a trembling hand. I couldn't sleep. I went for a walk. Just to the well and back. I saw something by the trench. A shape. I thought it might be an animal at first." She broke off, voice shaking. Poirot's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. Captain Maitland took over. "I've already sent for reinforcements." No one leaves the compound. This is now a police matter. Poirot gave a curt nod. Bien. But if I may, Captain, I suggest we allow the crime scene to remain untouched. It is not only what is present that matters. It is what is not present. He turned slowly, letting his gaze sweep the darkness. There was no sign of forced entry. The trench lay well within the guarded perimeter. No worker could have wandered in by chance. This murder, like the first, was intimate. Back in the compound, the mood had soured further. Fear had become not just a rumor, but a presence in the air. People spoke in hushed tones. Meals were left uneaten. Even the desert wind seemed hesitant to move. Poirot summoned Dr. Leadner, Captain Maitland, and the remaining members of the inner circle to the mess tent. The lanterns cast long shadows across the canvas walls as he stood at the head of the table, fingertips resting lightly on the polished wood. This second death, he began, was not spontaneous. It was not an act of panic or rage. No, it was calculated, and it was meant to silence. The silence in the tent tightened. He let his eyes pass over each face, pausing longer on Anne Mercado, then Richard Emmett, and finally on Dr. Leadner himself. We must ask, Poirot continued softly, what David Willoughby knew, or what he had begun to suspect. Dr. Leadner exhaled. He was cautious. He didn't socialize much outside his work. None, Poirot said, but he watched, observed. He knew architecture, how to see a structure's flaws. Perhaps he saw the flaw in a human structure. OUI. Captain Maitland frowned. You think the murders are linked? Poirot tilted his head. I think we have not two crimes, Captain, but one crime with two consequences. He turned to Anne. Madam, did you not once say you feared your husband was being watched? Anne hesitated. Yes. Louise told me that she thought someone was spying. At night. Through the shutters. And did she ever name who? A pause. No, she whispered. Only that she didn't trust anyone here. Poirot nodded slowly. Then we must discover who was not being watched, because they had already gained her trust. That night, Poirot returned to Louise Leadner's room. He sat in the chair she had once occupied and laid the photograph from earlier upon the desk. Faces stared back at him, smiling, sunlit. He took out a pencil and began drawing delicate circles around certain eyes. Not those that smiled, but those that watched the others smile. Always, always watching. In one corner, he drew a final circle, around David Willoughby. A quiet man. Not central. Not threatening. But observant. He had seen something, and someone had ensured he would never speak of it. Poirot leaned back, fingertips pressed together, the lines of his brow deep with thought. 2 murders. No signs of forced entry. Both victims struck silently, efficiently, without warning. And at the heart of it all, a fear buried deep in Louise Leadner's eyes before her death. It was not a curse from antiquity that had haunted her. It was something far more modern, far more personal. And now, it was hunting again. Chapter 7. A Second Cry in the Desert. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the ridged hills of Mesopotamia, casting long shadows over the excavation camp. In the hush of early evening, with the air turning cooler and the shifting sands momentarily stilled, Hercule Poirot prepared to deepen his psychological inquisition. He was not one for drama, not one for impulsive confrontation. Instead, he moved with delicacy, like a surgeon probing gently around an inflamed wound, knowing precisely where to apply pressure. The time had come, he had decided, not to question facts, but to observe truths, those subtle betrayals of thought and feeling that no suspect could ever fully disguise. He began with Richard Carey. The architect sat alone near the edge of the site, sketching ruins with a charcoal stick, his lines measured and bold. Poirot approached softly, his patent leather shoes leaving no print in the settling dust. Carey turned. "Monsieur Poirot, looking for more confessions in the gravel?" Poirot smiled mildly. "Not confessions, monsieur, only confirmations." They spoke of architecture, of foundations and stress lines. But Poirot steered the conversation to the past with the ease of a master fencer. "You knew Louise well," he said gently. "And her marriage? You did not approve?" "Non." Carey's eyes narrowed. "I thought she was too sharp to settle for a man like Eric Liedner. But she did. And once she did, I respected it." Poirot tilted his head. "You once told someone that she was wasting herself on a broken man. That is a curious phrase, is it not?" Carey's hand tightened slightly on the charcoal stick, then relaxed. "I was angry at the time. I got over it." "Sometimes we get over things so completely, we forget to mourn them," Poirot murmured, already turning away. Later that evening, he found Dr. Riley alone near the medical tent, sipping something amber from a tin cup. Riley, always affable, smiled broadly as Poirot approached. "I admire your stamina, Monsieur Poirot. A lesser man would be dazed by the sand and secrets of this place." "I do not daze, doctor," Poirot said with mock solemnity. "But I do become curious when wounds do not bleed." Riley chuckled. "You're poetic tonight." Poirot observed him closely. "Did you love her, doctor?" "Louise Liedner." The laughter faded from Riley's eyes, though the smile remained. "I loved the idea of her. Does that count?" Poirot gave no reply. He was watching the man's posture, the guarded gaze, the small delay in his answer. "And yet," he continued, "when one loves, even the idea, it stings, non, to see that idea destroyed." Riley's smile finally broke. "We all carry our losses differently. I carry mine with a drink and a joke." Poirot said nothing more. His next visit was to Anne Johnson. He found her organizing expedition notes with military efficiency. She did not glance up when he entered the tent. "If you've come to question me, Monsieur Poirot, I assure you I know very little." Poirot nodded. "It is what one believes they do not know that often reveals what they most fear." She looked at him then, sharply. "Meaning?" "You watched Louise Liedner closely. Not as a friend, more as a biographer watching a story unfold. You saw the cracks no one else did." Johnson stiffened. "I respected her. But she wasn't harmless." "Ah," Poirot said. "A dangerous woman, perhaps." "Not dangerous. Damaged. And sometimes, the damaged hurt others without meaning to." Poirot lingered in silence, letting her words settle in the air. Then he gave her a short bow and left. Finally, he visited Miss Amy Leatheran, who had retreated to the dig house. She was reading one of her nursing manuals by lamplight, her face pale and withdrawn. Poirot spoke softly. "You do not sleep well, Mademoiselle Leatheran?" She looked up, startled. "No. I suppose I'm still shaken." "You were perhaps closer to Madame Liedner than you realized. You saw her not just as a patient, but as a person." Amy hesitated. She was complicated. You never quite knew if what she said was what she meant. Poirot stepped closer. "And yet, you trusted her." "I wanted to. I think everyone did." Poirot's voice dropped further. "Did you fear her, mademoiselle?" A pause. "Sometimes." He nodded, gently. "Then you saw the truth." Poirot walked out into the desert night. The stars had pierced the heavens, sharp as needles. Beneath them, the dig site lay silent, sleeping, or pretending to. The minds of the suspects were unraveling, knot by careful knot. The lies were not loud. They were soft, layered, almost affectionate. But Poirot had begun to see the shape behind the mask. The murderer had overplayed only one thing: confidence. In thinking themselves safe, they had spoken too much or too little. Soon, very soon, the final thread would tug, and all would collapse. Chapter 8. Dust and Deception. Morning broke over the dig with a pale, chalky light. The winds had stilled, and a brittle silence hung over the site as if the desert itself held its breath. Breakfast was subdued, no idle chatter, no clatter of cutlery, only the occasional scrape of spoon on porcelain. The staff and workers felt it. The tension, the eyes watching, the unspoken truth buried just beneath the surface. Poirot sat apart, his boiled eggs untouched, eyes turned inward. His mind was active, filtering through voices, pauses, missteps, those imperceptible betrayals that no criminal, no matter how clever, could suppress completely. And now, a new element entered the puzzle. A knock at his quarters. Amy Leatheran stood there, clutching something folded in her hand, her expression unreadable. "I found this," she said without preamble, "under a loose floorboard in the corner of the late Madame Leadner's room. I was straightening up when the wood shifted." Poirot gestured gently for her to enter. She stepped inside and handed him the paper, a letter, aged and folded several times. The envelope bore no postmark. The handwriting on the front, "To be read if I am found dead." He opened it slowly. Inside, in Louise Leadner's elegant, flowing script, was a single page. He read it in silence, his eyes darkening as he moved line by line, until at last, he let out a soft, almost imperceptible breath. It was not a confession. It was not an accusation. It was a warning. "There is someone here who hates me, though they wear a friendly face. I have sensed it for weeks now. Their kindness is too polished, their interest too intense. I do not know how or when they will strike, but I feel it coming. If I am dead, then they have succeeded. The answer lies in the past, as it always does." Poirot read the final line twice. The answer lies in the past. He folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. Then he turned to Amy. "This is most valuable, mademoiselle. But not because it tells us who committed the crime. It tells us how Madame Leadner saw the world. And perhaps, how she saw her end." Amy swallowed. "Do you think she knew who it was?" "I think she guessed," Poirot said softly. "But she did not confront them. That is not fear, it is control. Madame Leadner, for all her charms, was a manipulator." Amy said nothing more. She left the room quietly, but Poirot lingered. He tapped the envelope thoughtfully, his brows drawn together. There was a tone to the letter that disturbed him, not just the content, but its timing. Why had Louise hidden it? Why not send it? Why bury the truth under a floorboard rather than speak it aloud? Unless she had meant for someone else to find it. Someone specific. Moments later, he gathered the suspects. In the makeshift dining hall, the key members of the expedition were seated once more. Dr. Riley with a fresh cup of coffee, and Johnson cool and silent beside him, Richard Carey leaning back with arms folded, and the young archaeologist David Emerson fidgeting slightly. Eric Leadner had not appeared. Poirot noted his absence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, "we are now nearing the end. You may not realize it, but the truth is no longer hiding. It is simply waiting for the right moment to be seen." A faint smile passed his lips. The killer, they believed themselves clever. And truly, they were. They planned not only a murder but a narrative. They created fear. A ghost from the past. A second identity. But even the most skilled liar forgets. Truth leaves residue. In memory, in motive, and, most crucially, in behavior. He turned to Anne Johnson. Mademoiselle, you told me that Madame Leadner had enemies. That she had secrets. Yet you also told me you never once heard her speak of these things in detail. Which is curious for a woman you described as constantly performing. Anne raised an eyebrow. She liked to be mysterious. It made her feel important. Or, Poirot countered, it was not mystery, it was protection. A performance that allowed her to mask deeper knowledge. He shifted to Richard Carey. And you, monsieur, you claim detachment. Professionalism. But your reactions to Madame Leadner's death were not those of a man surprised. They were those of a man, resigned. Carey met his gaze with calm irritation. You're drawing conclusions from feelings. Poirot raised a finger. Feelings, monsieur, are more truthful than words. But before another reply could be made, a new presence entered the tent, Eric Leadner. He walked stiffly, his face pale, but composed. I was told you found something, he said. Poirot nodded. Indeed. A letter. From your late wife. Hidden beneath the floorboards of her room. A silence fell. Leadner's face changed subtly, a tightening around the mouth, the eyes blinking faster than usual. Poirot handed him the letter. Leadner read it, slowly, and for a moment, no one breathed. When he looked up, he said only, she was frightened. Poirot's eyes narrowed. She was more than frightened. She was certain. Carey leaned forward. What exactly is it that you're implying, Poirot? Poirot folded his hands. I am not implying. I am observing. And what I observe is that the killer knew Madame Leadner feared for her life. They knew she would suspect them. And so they acted, before she could reveal too much. And Johnson spoke now, voice low. But that could describe any of us. Not quite, Poirot replied. For there is one more truth yet to be revealed. Something small. Something Madame Leadner mentioned just once in passing. And that detail now explains everything. He paused. Tomorrow, I shall invite you all to a final gathering. There, I will present the solution. And with that, he rose, nodding politely, and exited. The desert winds stirred once more. The trap was set. Chapter 9. The Puzzle of the Ink-Stained Note. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of the dig site, turning canvas tents into silhouettes and stone fragments into teeth jutting from the earth. In the central mess tent, a small table had been set. 6 chairs stood around it. No tea, no refreshments. Only tension, sharpened and silent. Poirot stood before them, hands folded neatly behind his back, eyes bright beneath the rim of his hat. Every suspect had come, drawn by equal parts curiosity and dread. Eric Leadner sat nearest to him, a pale mask of composure stretched over hollow eyes. And Johnson kept her arms crossed, jaw tight, the habitual coolness in her gaze now tinged with apprehension. Richard Carey leaned against the support beam, watchful but contained. David Emerson had positioned himself by the flap, one foot half-turned outward, as if contemplating escape. Dr. Riley sipped slowly from a chipped enamel cup, eyebrows slightly raised, giving the impression of detached amusement. And Miss Amy Leatheran stood nearby, at Poirot's quiet invitation, a silent observer to the closing act. Poirot cleared his throat gently. My friends, he began, this has been no ordinary crime. The death of Madame Leadner was not committed in the heat of passion, nor was it the result of an opportunistic moment. None, it was executed with precision, long planning, and the cold logic of someone who believed themselves capable of committing the perfect murder. He let that sink in before continuing. But there is no such thing as a perfect murder, not when the motive is buried beneath layers of resentment, and the truth whispers from the shadows of psychology. He turned slightly, pacing with careful rhythm. Let us consider the facts. Madame Leadner, Louise, was not simply a woman with a mysterious past. She was a woman who knew she was in danger. Her letter, hidden under the floorboards, spoke of fear, of hatred behind politeness. She had, in her own way, deduced what I too would come to see. Her killer walked among us in plain sight. Poirot stopped before Eric Leadner. Monsieur, you told me your wife suffered from nervous fantasies. That she feared a dead man, her previous husband, might return. But what if the danger she feared was not from beyond the grave, but from beside her at the breakfast table? Leadner's expression did not change. He replied quietly, I never believed in that ghost story. I humored her. Just so, said Poirot. And you were right not to believe. Because the idea of Frederick Bosner returning from the dead was a fiction, cleverly woven into the narrative by the killer to blur reality and misdirect suspicion. He faced the rest now. There was no returned husband, no vengeful ghost. What there was jealousy, pain, rejection, and a love that curdled into hatred. He walked to the center of the tent, his voice tightening slightly with intensity. Madame Leadner had once been in love with a man who died, or so she believed. That ghost followed her, not in spirit, but as memory. And she married again, thinking herself safe. But even in marriage, she retained her power. Her beauty, her charisma, she held men in thrall, including one man here. Poirot paused, then turned slowly toward Richard Carey. Monsieur Carey. A ripple of stillness passed through the room. You were in love with her. You masked it well, but only to those who did not look closely. I watched you, monsieur. The silence that followed her name. The way your eyes did not move to her photograph when others glanced there. The quiet resignation in your voice. You loved her, and she knew it, but she did not return it. Carey's face remained still, but the jaw tensed. You are mistaken, he said. Poirot smiled gently. Non. I am not mistaken. And that rejection, polite, even gentle, was nonetheless final. You, monsieur, could not bear it. And so you plotted. Not impulsively, but with the mind of an archaeologist, carefully, methodically. You created the myth of Frederick Bosner's return, planting seeds in Louise's imagination until they sprouted into fear. You intercepted letters. You mimicked a handwriting. You made her believe the past had come alive again. Poirot raised a hand before Carey could reply. And then, when her fear peaked, when she retreated, isolated, you struck. You entered her room through the adjoining balcony. You knew she was alone. You used a heavy object, perhaps one of the survey weights or a stone artifact, to deliver a single fatal blow. There was no forced entry, no sign of struggle. You returned the same way you came. Carey stood now. You have no proof of any of this. Poirot nodded. Ah, but that is where you were, monsieur. The proof is not in fingerprints, not in dust or fibers. It is in psychology. It is in the detail Madame Leadner spoke of in passing to Miss Leathern, a single memory, barely remarked upon. He turned to Amy. You told me that a few nights before her death, Madame Leadner said someone on the dig had once quoted a poem she loved. A poem only Frederick Bosner had ever recited to her. She called it an uncanny coincidence. Poirot looked back at Carey, who had frozen. Only one man could have known that poem. Not because he was Frederick Bosner, but because she had shared it with him once, years ago, when she still trusted him. And it stayed with you, Monsieur Carey. It was your tell. The silence that followed was absolute. Carey remained upright, but his shoulders had slumped. He looked not at Poirot, but at the floor. "I never meant to hurt her," he said quietly. "I only wanted her to see me, to see what she had." Poirot said nothing. Dr. Riley stood abruptly. "Good Lord!" Amy stared. "Then, he was always here. Not some ghost from the past." Poirot inclined his head. "The ghost was of our own making, but the killer was flesh and blood." And Johnson whispered, "She knew. She just didn't say." Poirot turned back to Richard Carey. "The authorities will be notified. You may wait in your quarters." Carey nodded once, then walked out into the fading sun. Poirot exhaled softly. Justice is not always elegant, but it must always arrive. Chapter 10. Justice Served. The desert winds had quieted. In the hours that followed Richard Carey's confession and quiet surrender to the authorities, the atmosphere at the expedition site transformed. Where once the air had crackled with suspicion and unspoken tension, now came stillness, heavy, solemn, but somehow clarifying. Like sand settling after a storm. Poirot stood once more atop the ancient walls of the tell, gazing out at the vast Mesopotamian plains, his silhouette outlined against a sky turning ochre and violet. Below, the dig tents flapped gently, no longer shadows of secrets, but ordinary shelters beneath a waning sun. Miss Amy Leatheran approached, footsteps soft on the dust-hardened ground. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked. "You knew it was Carey long before the gathering." Poirot's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "I suspected, mademoiselle. Not from evidence in the usual sense, but from the human heart. It reveals itself, always." She stood beside him, silent for a moment. "He didn't seem like a murderer." "No murderer ever does," Poirot replied gently. "They seem like husbands, colleagues, admirers, until the moment passion crosses into possession, and resentment finds no outlet but destruction." Amy considered this. And what about Louise? Did she truly know it was him? "She suspected," Poirot said, nodding slowly. "But she did not want to believe it. That is often the way. She saw the signs, his quietness, his withdrawal, the moments when his affection soured, but she chose to attribute them to other causes. Sometimes, the truth is too painful to acknowledge." Amy looked away. She was a difficult woman, but she didn't deserve to die. "Non," said Poirot, softly. "She did not. But her tragedy was to inspire too much passion in too many hearts. That is a power not always wielded by choice, but always paid for." They stood in silence a while longer. From the main compound, Dr. Riley's voice could be heard barking some logistical instruction. And Johnson, her face paler than usual, moved with robotic precision, boxing equipment. Even Eric Liedner, now a broken figure, remained confined to his quarters, waiting for word from the authorities, his life's passion now indelibly stained. Amy turned. "And what will you do now, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mademoiselle. I shall return to my little flat in London. I will sit in my chair by the window, with a tisane and perhaps a plate of fine pastries. And I will let the world go on around me without interruption. Until, bien sûr, the next mystery knocks." She smiled. "You make it sound so peaceful." But of course, for Hercule Poirot, peace is order. And where murder thrives, it is disorder that reigns. Now that the balance is restored, he tilted his head slightly. "I may rest." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting a final golden glow across the earth, Poirot descended the stone steps one last time. He walked slowly past the tents, past the remnants of ancient civilizations half buried in dust, and into the fading light. Miss Leatheran remained behind, watching as his figure grew smaller, then vanished altogether into the curve of the earth. The wind picked up again, soft now, whispering not of ghosts or betrayal, but of things returned to their rightful places. Far beneath the tell, the sands shifted, covering the ruins anew. And above, the stars emerged, silent witnesses to both past and present, watching once more as the desert, at last, began to rest. And so, beneath the blazing sun and ancient stones of Mesopotamia, justice has been unearthed, one secret at a time. Hercule Poirot, with his unerring sense of human nature and the precision of his little grey cells, has once again reminded us. The past is never truly buried, not when truth still breathes among the living. Thank you for joining me on this haunting journey through mystery and memory. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to leave a like, share it with fellow mystery lovers, and subscribe to Moonlight Audiobooks so you never miss another case. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Who did you suspect? Were you surprised by the reveal? Let's chat in the comments below. Until next time, keep your minds sharp, your hearts curious, and always trust the truth to rise.